It's not what you're here for, right? So let me tell you about what we're going to do this evening. After my welcome to you here, we're going to invite Mari Evans to come up. Mari's a world-renowned poet who lives here in the community, a couple blocks away. She's going to frame the evening for us with a poem to begin with and a poem to end the evening with. Then Mark McAlevey is going to come and introduce tonight's speaker, or in a way, tonight's speakers. We welcome you to this evening, and then John's going to speak for about an hour, and then there will be a chance to have some conversation with him, to have some questions and hopefully a little talk back and forth. And then again, Mari will close the evening with a poem. So I just want to welcome you on behalf of Broadway to John McKnight and Ivan Illich. You'll have a very good time and informative time this evening. So I asked Mari to come now and to give us a poem to begin with.
Good evening. Mike selected this one. I have poems that are longer. But Mike selected this. I think he feels that it expresses the tenor of the evening. It's called The Rebel. When I die, I'm sure I will have a big funeral. Curiosity seekers coming to see if I am really dead, or just trying to make trouble.
Mark, follow that.
Thanks for coming. Have a good evening. I don't know how to follow that, but I just wanted to kind of frame, the evening, if I can, and share with you how we all got here today, in a few short sentences or more. So, John McKnight and Ivan Illich have been a friend of this congregation for a long time, and maybe they didn't even know it. And one of the interesting things about Broadway United Methodist Church and some of the people here is we have kind of a strange belief, and I don't mean to sound cultish in any way, but we have this belief that in some ways and then sometimes and in some places the dead can be raised. And in fact, that is part of what we do in life is constantly raise the dead. I experienced this with Ivan Illich on a couple different occasions. Namely, the first time I stepped foot in this church, I was in my first year at the Indiana University School of Social Work Master's of Social Work program. And my wife and I had been looking for a church, and we live 4 blocks from this place, and decided one day to come. And so here I am in grad school, studying to be a professional helper, if you will. And Mike Mather, who you just heard from, a pastor here, stood up on that pulpit and said, "Stop helping people." And I was like, this SOB. I mean, seriously, I've already dedicated, X amount of curricular hours, X amount of money, so I could become a professional helper. What is he talking about? And what I have come to know as experiencing what he was saying here in this community is what he meant was stop helping people and start caring for people. And that was, in that instant, Ivan Illich came back to life here. A couple years later, I told this story at lunch today. A couple years later, they had this really wonderful thing in Toronto called the Toronto Summer Institute, put on by the Inclusion Press and several wonderful people who are leading the way for inclusion in this world. And I wanted to go. And I couldn't get out of school. They wouldn't let me leave for that extended period of time in my graduate program to go to this institute. So instead, and I don't mean to make this sound like a plan B, but I went to Chicago for a ABCD training, asset-based community development training, where I was with John McKnight and a wonderful fella named Henry Moore, who is past but still living, I'd say. And what Mike Mather told me before I went up there to meet with John and everybody else was, when you talk to John McKnight, the first thing you should do is ask him to tell you a story about Ivan Illich. And John, I don't know if you remember this, but in Chicago, I cornered you in the midst of about 60 amazing community builders and said, tell me a story about Ivan Illich. And without skipping a beat, he launched into this beautiful soliloquy about Ivan Illich and how he told John to grieve. And at that moment again, Ivan Illich was back. And it was powerful. And those moments have been powerful around here. And we wanted to see if John McKnight, we kind of got this message to him with this crazy idea to have a conversation with him and Ivan Illich here at Broadway and to raise him from the dead, so to speak. I don't think that you all need much more introduction to John, other than the fact that I just heard a really great story he told about how he wrote a letter of recommendation for our president to the Harvard Law School. He has made ripples in this world. He has connected thousands of people together doing amazing things, and he's one heck of a storyteller. Everybody, John McKnight.
Me a Bible? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, right. Now, they told me that the first faith and primary religion of the state of Indiana was basketball. And you people must be apostates. When Mike and Mark suggested that I might remember with a group of people Ivan Illich, I thought there can't be 6 people in Indianapolis who ever knew Ivan. And I thought, well, it'll be a pretty small group. And then I learned that this is the last evening of the Sweet 16, and I thought, I'm going to be alone here. So I guess you don't believe in the true faith. Looking for something else to do this evening. In thinking about what I might share with you, a couple of caveats. One time when Ivan came to the United States, he would usually stay with me and my wife, and then I'd usually arrange for him to give a lecture at the university where I was on the faculty, Northwestern. And one time, actually he was in a chapel with a bunch of alumni giving a lecture. And one of the faculty members was one of my very best friends, and who was a very technologically able person, went back there at the end of the room, and Ivan was in the front, and he wanted to take his picture, so he was getting like this. And Ivan stopped what he was saying and said, "Don't do that!" And my friend, of course, was horrified. And then he said, "You can't capture me." And let me start by saying that. I can't capture Ivan. All I can do is say, I'm a pretty old guy with a faded memory. And so instead of capture, I think what I can do is maybe give capsules. High points of memory. And so that's what I've tried to do, because I can't do anything else. is to just remember those things in our lives together that were especially significant. Let me ask before I begin, has anybody here been around Illich any time where he might have spoken or anything? Not a single person, huh? Well, Judith has, right? Yeah, right, one person. Now, has anybody ever read anything that he's written? Could you raise your hand? A few people, all right. Well, then, let me give you a biography of Illich, which is not, I think, if you went to Google or Wikipedia, you probably wouldn't get this biography, because this is a biography of things I remember that he told me about his life. And to give you a little sense, if he were here, he was 5 years older than I am. So if he had lived longer, he could have been here, and I think amazed you as much as he has amazed everybody who ever knew him. He was born in what we would call Yugoslavia, or now Serbia. And his father was from the nobility, was a Serbian count. And his mother was a Viennese Jew. And so they were an unusual couple in that regard. I don't know how they met. And I remember his telling me that his father had great vineyards, and that one day he went out with his father to look at the vineyards, and he was on a horse, and his father was on a horse. He said I was probably only 5 or 6 years old. And his father said, we'll go out and we'll see the peasants who were working in the vineyards. But Ivan misheard his father and thought that his father said, we'll go out and be a peasant. And so he said that they rode through the vineyards and looked down at all the people who were working there in the vines. And when he came back, he said to his father, it's a wonderful thing to be a peasant. And I think that had a lot of effect on him in the rest of his life, because he came to understand his mistake. Right? Somehow, I can't give you this very accurately, his father and his mother separated. His father was a Catholic, his mother was Jewish, and he went with his mother to Vienna, where he was raised until I think about halfway through high school. He might have gone to Vienna when he was 6 or 7. There, his mother was a Steinerite. How many of you know about Steiner, Rudolf Steiner? The founder of things you might know, the Waldorf schools, the Camp Hill villages, a great philosopher, a man who still has influence on the lives of a lot of people. And for those of you who are interested in intellectual antecedents, it's pretty clear to me that her Steiner was there in Vienna, knew his mother was a follower, and that there was a real learning and culture that was transmitted to Ivan because of Steiner. And Steiner, among other things, was convinced that a life worth living had to be a life connected to the aesthetic world. And so Waldorf schools are schools where one would pay more attention to aesthetics than to computers. So I think he had a lot of influence in that way. He also said that his mother was in a circle of very intellectual people of Vienna, and that he thought that how he learned was that when the visitors would come to sit and have coffee around the table, that his mother would let him sit under the table and listen. And as you may not know, and this will be coming forward here, Illich thought the world's greatest crime was a school. And so, in his mind, the world's greatest educational experience was under a table, where he could listen to great people with great minds in great dialogue. And I think that had a lot of influence on him as well. He was, and I don't understand how this happened, even though he was raised with his mother, who was not a Catholic, he was raised nonetheless in her household as a Catholic. And after the Nazis began to take over, he and his mother fled Austria. And Ivan went to the Vatican, where I think he completed high school and then went to a Vatican college. And as the Germans took over from the Italians as the war went on, it became more dangerous for Ivan because of his Jewish heritage, even though he was in a Vatican college. So he left and went up into the mountains of Italy and joined the partisans up there, and spent 2 years of the war as a young man with the partisans in the mountains. And he told me that he was young, and the only thing that he had that was useful was that he knew English. And he said the Allies from North Africa would send planes over to drop supplies to the partisans in the mountains of Italy so that they could survive and blow up German ammunition dumps and that kind of thing. And he said one time a bunch of parachutes came down. They were a delivery from the Allies. And he said they looked through everything and they could figure it out. But there were a bunch of cans, he said, about this big that were khaki-colored, military colors with a stencil of some numbers on it, but it didn't say what it was. And they opened it up, he said, and they had never seen anything like it. It had all come from the Americans, he said, but we had never seen it. And he said it was sort of a brown paste-like thing. He said, so we thought it was probably explosive, so we put wicks in it and lit it, and it didn't blow up. The wicks just went out. So he said they sent us so many of these cans each time that we didn't know what to do with them. So he said, since he knew English, they had a radio and they sent a message back to North America giving the number of the cans and saying, what is this that you have in these cans? And the answer came back, peanut butter. And so that was his introduction, he said, to the United States of America, was to learn about this strange, pasty brown stuff called peanut butter that wouldn't even explode with a wick. Well, after the war, he became a Roman Catholic priest, and I am sure, knowing his intellect, he was the smartest person I have ever met by far in my life. And so I am sure the people of the Vatican had him placed for climbing up the ladder there. But instead, he asked to be sent to New York City. He said he wanted to do parish work in New York. And I'm sure he told me, but I can't remember why he ever would have asked to do that. But he did. And so it was arranged, and he was sent to New York City, and he was made the assistant pastor of a Roman Catholic church, I think in Manhattan, in a Puerto Rican neighborhood. And the priest of this church was an old Irish alcoholic priest, right, who didn't understand the Puerto Ricans at all, couldn't speak Spanish. But Ivan, of course, incidentally, who, when I knew him, knew 11 languages fluently, and the Lord knows how many others, fairly well. And so he knew Spanish. And so he began to go door to door and talk to the parishioners and get to know them, and began to get new parishioners and built up the church. And then he thought that it would be important if this community of newly arrived people from Puerto Rico would begin to take their place in the sun. And so he did his first real organizing job and created the first community organization of Puerto Ricans in New York City. And then they decided to have a big festival, the first festival on the day of their patron saint. And the festival was hugely successful. So successful, so many thousands of people of Puerto Rican ancestry appeared, that the police became very frightened. They had never seen this kind of gathering. So very threatening. The politicians thought this was very threatening. But nonetheless, it was the beginning of that community's ascent into economic and political life. He then decided that he wanted, he sort of fell in love with Puerto Rico, and that he would like to go there and learn more about the country and the culture. And so there was an opening at the Catholic University of Puerto Rico, and he was sent there to be the vice chancellor. And it was there that I think his life really took its major turn, because he had a dream when he went there of taking his leadership position in the university and seeing if it wouldn't be possible to begin to develop Puerto Rico as a place where everybody went to school and everybody went to the university. And the more he tried that and looked at its possibilities, he concluded that it was impossible, that that couldn't be achieved. But even more, he met there a sociologist named Everett Reimer, and the two of them began to think about people in less developed societies and schools, and what schools represented. And he concluded with Everett Reimer that the idea of school was the enemy of real progress in a community. And Everett went on to write a book called, which you can still get, called School is Dead. And Illich decided that his future should be to ask, in honesty, what preserves the culture of community? Because he came to see, he thought, that schools were the enemy of the culture of community. What would nurture the culture of community? And he began a walking venture. He walked several thousand miles through South America with a shawl, and would sleep on the ground and or in somebody's village square, or wherever anybody would take him in. And he met Paulo Freire during that walk, and many of you probably have heard of him. They became good friends. And then he walked up into Mexico and came to a town called Cuernavaca, which is about 60 miles south of Mexico City, and decided to settle there. He liked that place. And he began to create an institute which had the initial CIDOC, C-I-D-O-C, and it was at this point he became a rather famous figure in the world. And that was an institution that was designed to prepare, it was designed to teach people Spanish in a very brief period of time, that you could go there, and in 6 weeks you would be able to be fluent speaking and pretty able writing Spanish. But of greater importance, it was to be a place where people from the north could come and learn about the communities and cultures of villages in Latin America. But as it emerged, he became convinced that there was no serious possibility that a person from the north, from here, could do any good in a village in Latin America. And so he concluded that what he should do is make this institute into a place that convinced young people who were going to be missionaries with various churches, or people who are going into the Peace Corps, to keep away from the villages of Latin America. He said, my job is to turn them around, to send them back to the United States, to keep them from bringing their imperial technological vision that will destroy the culture of community from going. And he was very serious about that. And then this place also developed into, I think, the great intellectual gathering place of the 1960s. And everybody who was thinking anew would go there and talk and think together. And that's the time that when I happened to meet him. But before I go into that, let me add a few other things. He tried to create an alternative to a school in CIDOC. Now, what CIDOC was, physically, was the mansion and estate of a very rich person up on top of a hill. And the rich person, I don't know what happened to him, but Ivan leased this place. And it worked like this. You had to pay $100 if you wanted to participate, but you could stay there all year for $100 if you wanted to. And then just inside the gate, there was a big wall. And if you wanted to teach anything at all, you could write on the wall a description on a card of what you wanted to teach, and how much you wanted any student to pay you to teach them that thing. And so everybody who came there was encouraged both to teach and to learn. And so if you arrived there, you'd look at all of these things and you'd say, well, I'd like to maybe take this course and this course and this course. These courses would be a week long or 2 weeks, right? And you'd put up your own, maybe. And then, the first day, on a Monday, you could go and listen to the presentation of the people you liked, right? You'd try them out. And if you didn't like them, you didn't have to return, and you didn't pay them. But if you did think they had something to teach you, then the second day when you went, you had to pay them. Now, this was not much, so $10, $5, something like that. So that it was a self-defining teaching, learning opportunity with freedom of total choice. And it was one of the richest, most exciting places of learning that I've ever been. I went there about the time I went in mid-career to the university. And I must say, universities are dull places compared to CIDOC and what was going on there. It was just a very, very exciting place. And there I had the opportunity, I was thinking about people I met there. I think one of the great influences on Illich's thought was a man named Paul Goodman. Does anybody here know of Paul Goodman? All right. Get his book, you can still get it, called Growing Up Absurd, and see if it's your own life story. It may well be. And it had a great influence on Illich, Paul Goodman. So he was there. I remember meeting him. Right up the hill lived Erich Fromm. People here know Erich Fromm. And he was a great philosopher, psychologist, intellectual. Jacques Ellul, I met there. A man who understood how technological our society is. Susan Sontag was one of Illich's greatest friends. John Holt and all the educational reformers were there. So it was a wonderful venture, and each day at noon, under a great banyan tree, Illich, who was always writing a book in those days, would come out and sit under the banyan tree and read the 4 or 5 pages that he had written that day, and asked for critique and discussion. And it was a great, great learning opportunity with a great, great diversity of people. And I told you maybe more than you want to know about it, because it is possible to create a place where young people can learn and thinkers can talk. And that's not what most universities are. So he still has created a challenge in my mind for the great opportunity we have. The people in this room could create something infinitely more challenging, more intellectual, more thought-provoking than any university in this state. I know it because I saw it, and I was in it. And who did it was people like us. So maybe we can revive a place of learning, at any rate. About this time, also, the Vatican got tired of Illich, and they called him in, and they held a trial, a formal trial, and I'm sorry I can't tell you the name of this kind of a trial.
Apostolic investigation.
An apostolic investigation, which could throw him out if he was found guilty. Incidentally, the New Yorker magazine has a long, wonderful article at the time about this trial. But Ivan was so smart, he beat the Vatican at their own game, and they found him not guilty because he used their own rules on them. He didn't defy them. He just used their own rules against them. But he said when he was done to them, he said, "I will forevermore never say a public mass." And he never did. But he was an Orthodox Catholic priest to his dying day. In fact, in his latter days, every evening he would go through the Holy Office, and I remember often sitting with him, and he'd light a candle, and we'd sit over a table and go through the Holy Office. So he was a man radical in his thought, but very orthodox in his faith. Proves you can be both. Right? Now, the way I came into this picture was I was raised a Covenanter. It's a dissenting faith, Reform, extremist Presbyterians, I suppose you'd call them. And there were, in the United States, about 5,000 of them. There are another 10,000 in Northern Ireland and another 1,000 in Scotland, and that was us, the Covenanters. And we had a faith And the faith that I remember was best expressed by my grandfather. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I can remember this he bounced me on his knee, and then every once in a while he'd part his legs, and I would start to drop, and he'd catch me and he'd lift me up, right? It was very exciting. But when he lifted me up, this is almost Pavlovian, he would say to me, "John, if a majority of people agree with you, you must be wrong." And he was not joking, right? Because they had such unique and peculiar beliefs that everybody around them didn't believe what they believed. So they had some way to justify themselves. They were also, obviously, for the same reason, Old Testament people, much more than they were New Testament people. But at any rate, I came out of a family of a strong dissenting position, very distrustful that the institutions of society would lead you in the right direction. And then there are two other things that influenced me a great deal, which I think then made the friendship initially that I had with Illich. And the first was that when I got out of college, I became involved with a group of people who were being trained as organizers by Saul Alinsky. How many people here know about Alinsky? Okay. And regardless of anything else people may say about Saul, he was an ultimate Democrat, a Tocquevillian. And he had a huge influence on me because his methods were to confront institutions. The assumption was the institutions were messing over people. And our organizing methods were a way to at least minimize or stop them from messing over people. So here I was, this dissenter who knew that the majority must be wrong, then meeting Illich, who knew that institutions were messing over people. And then I went to the university, Northwestern University, and I'm not speaking ill of it in particular. I think it was sort of representative, but here I was, a young person. And I had read Alinsky before I went to college in a book called Reveille for Radicals. And I got to the university, and here I found this university was a citadel of discrimination. It admitted exactly 40 African American people a year. It admitted exactly 400 Jewish students a year. It would not allow any, this is in Chicago, right? This is in 1949, would not allow any African American student to live on campus. And I was just stunned. Here's my first experience with a great institution. And it was corrupt and rotten to the core. It had as its motto, "Whatsoever things are true, think on these things." That was on the gate where you entered. And when you entered, you were entering this hugely biased, discriminatory world. And so that's the other thing that had a great effect on me. So by the time I met Illich, I was probably 37, 38. And we met together at a place called the National Church Urban Training Center in Chicago. This would have been probably in 1968 or so, and clergy from all denominations went there to be prepared for the urban ministry. I'm sure somebody from here must have been there. Lots of people. And he and I were speaking to these clergy the same day, and that's how I happened to meet him. And I was in the morning and he was in the afternoon, and I was talking with people about the whole range of possibilities for reforming schools, all the things that we could do to reform schools. And then I had lunch, and I didn't know who Illich was from anybody. And I sat down, we had lunch, and he said to me, and this was, I think, my turning point in life. He said to me, I had never thought about all those possibilities for reforming schools. He said, and then he said, almost as though he thought it was curious, why did you want to reform them? And I didn't quite get it. And he said, why? Why do you want to reform schools? And I said, to make them better. And he said, what is it that you want to have happen to young people? Tell me. And I said some things. Maybe I'd like them to be wise, generous, kind, thoughtful. He said, and you think you'll do that in a school? He says, if that's what you want, what's making that not happen is school. And I think that was the first time that I had ever thought about the essential nature of an institutional structure. And in my subsequent life with my own children and being a faculty member at a university, this is a belated confession, I'm absolutely convinced now that the question he raised with me was the right one. If I had it to do all over again, I've made a lot of mistakes in my life, but the biggest mistake I ever made was to send my children to school. If I had my life to live over, I would never do it again. And I think together we began to explore that question and other questions in relationship to how would you do something if you didn't turn to an institution? How would you be healthy if you didn't have a doctor? How would you be wise if you didn't have a university? How would you be just if you didn't have a criminal justice system making more criminals than we had before it started? How would we be as a community if we weren't surrounded by social services determined to fix us? And so I think that's the path we tried to follow. Asking the question, what is it we really want? And would you really turn to an institution to try to achieve that? And if you realize that you can't, then what would you do? Well, that's why CDOC was his effort to say, well, what you could do is what CDOC is. Have a place, an exciting place of choice and learning for people, right? Now, I want to say that while I spent a lot of time with him until he died, probably 35, 36 years, the thing that I think of more than anything else is he's the greatest intellect I've ever known. And I think most people think one of the greatest intellects of the age. And I am not. And yet, we became very close. He always stayed with me. And I couldn't figure out why. I mean, half the time I never understood what he was saying. And I'd be in these discussions with great minds, just trying to get a little of it. After a while, I learned the language, began to figure out a little more. But he said to me one time, I think I raised, I said, Illich, why do you put up with me? And he said, because you know instinctively what I struggled for 30 years to learn. And so I think I was his checkpoint on instinct. I was his canary in the mine. Medicalized was almost as bad as being schooled. And he wasn't going to make the values and culture of medicine a part of his life. And as strange as it was, if you were with Ivan for a day or two, it disappeared. You didn't notice. So, then some memories of things that I would share with you that I would say I heard or learned from him are these. He always described himself as being homeless, that he didn't have any particular place that he thought was his home. And I think that's right. He lived a life outside of any culture, although he understood each culture better than most anthropologists. But it was because he could stand outside a culture, even though he understood it well enough to be the organizer of the first Puerto Rican uprising, right, that his insights grew from the ability to step outside, to be outside. Because the only thing we don't understand very well, right, is our culture. It's like a fish doesn't understand water. We don't understand our culture. But he had an amazing capacity to see who we are and who we aren't, because he was finally a homeless man in that sense. He was always amused by the comic tragedy of the modern world. He was the greatest critic of the modern world, and very apocalyptic even about it, but he was always of good humor. He never let it get him down, right? And I remember as we would go through life together, do things together, and we'd see what he would consider an absolute craziness of the modern world, right? That people are looking enthused about. He'd look at me with a little wry smile and go, like that. One of these events, I remember, we were both asked to make presentations at the University of Pennsylvania. No, not the University of Pennsylvania, at Penn State. And Penn State has a hospitality department, a school of hospitality, something like that. And it has a hotel on the campus, very nice one, where the students learn. And so we were put up there. We got there late. It was probably 11:30 at night. There's a fire in the fireplace, nobody in the lounge but one guy. And we go in, because you could get a free drink. We sit there and have a drink. And this one guy was there. And Illich, this great European intellectual, right, begins to talk to this guy about what he's here for. And the guy says, "Well, I'm here for the Ice Cream Institute." And Illich says, "The Ice Cream Institute?" Right? And he says, "What is that?" Right? And the guy explains that he's being sent by the Kraft company for 10 weeks to this great pinnacle. The Harvard of ice cream is there at Penn State University, right? Where you learn everything there is to know about ice cream, right? And then, he went on to explain all the wonderful things. The thing I remember best is that ice cream is a legal name for something that can only have so much air put into it. If it gets beyond a certain percentage of air pumped into it, it then becomes dairy whip or something like that, right? So you should know that you're eating a legal category every time you have ice cream. And this guy goes on and on telling you. And Illich, as we walked away, can this be true? This is what your universities are? Teaching people to pump air in the milk? Come on, right? So, it was fun to walk through the modern world and see how absurd the modern world is, because once you begin to see what he saw, it illuminated, but it also brought a kind of humor to the craziness of our lives. At the same time, he suffered greatly because of the loss of community and culture that he saw modern society and technology bringing. And I remember, to him, the ultimate technology, the sum of all our technology which he thought was what Western civilization had created for the world. That what Western civilization is the substitute of the machine for community. And that its ultimate, the most powerful of all machines, is the atom bomb. And there was a great debate going on while he was at the University of Bremen, I remember, about the use of the atom bomb and whether we should have treaties about it. And he decided every day to go at noon to the main square in Bremen and stand there in silence. And he stood there for an hour every day. And he was standing there to say, the debate about whether we should use an atomic bomb is unspeakable. I am here to be silent in the face of that debate. To even come as a society to debate that question is an unspeakable evil. So he could laugh, and he suffered both. You can think of culture as something that develops in an evolutionary sense, but he and a lot of the intellectuals that he associated with, and where I'd sit at the edge of discussions, spent a great deal of time asking, can you move to the place where you have ended culture? Where culture ends. And Illich was convinced that you can, and that that's where we are. That culture is the way a people in a place learn how to survive. And that we are not a people in a place who can survive because we are total dependencies of institutions. We have no way. We have no culture. We are a manifestation of institutions and their way. We are people living, managed, technological lives. So how could we create a way? How could we be a community? And so he said, we have leaped out of culture. If there is anything we are in called a culture, it is the swamp of technology. And the person I think that he knew well and wrote most tellingly about this, and I would encourage you to look at, is Jacques Ellul's book, The Technological Society. It has no culture, no way. One of the things that I remember is that I used to think of, as in the periods when I wouldn't see him, maybe I'd see him every 3 months, I would think of questions that I wondered about. Since he was the most brilliant person I knew, I would think, I'll ask him. So I would write down these questions during these 3 months to ask him when we got together. Right? Maybe I'd go down to Cuernavaca or he'd come to my house, and I'd have 5 questions to ask. And each time I asked, he never, ever answered. Now, he responded, but he never answered. And it would usually take me a year to 2 years to figure out why what he said to my question had anything to do with my question. It always seemed to me what he was saying was brilliant, but I didn't necessarily connect it with the question that I had asked him. And I became a little frustrated with this, so about the 3rd or 4th time I did it, I quit asking him. And then I said to him, you know, I keep asking you questions you never answer. And he said, and this is a learning I would really pass on. He said, the only thing I can do to contribute to you is to proscribe the world you shouldn't enter. The thing I will never do is to prescribe what you should do in the world you're in. I can tell you about the tyrannies you will commit your life to in the institutional spectrum. And I can try to help you, I can try to proscribe your committing your lives to the cultureless, banal, and he would say, evil, technological society. But why do I do that? It's because I want you to come alive. And that's the space where if I prescribe, you won't come alive. In that space that he wouldn't prescribe, I was thinking that what he did believe in that space was surprise, sensefulness, and friendship. Ultimately, those were the values that he thought were essential for culture and community. Sensefulness, surprise, and what was the other I said? Friendship. All right. He came in his end of his life to believe that friendship was the core of everything that made community possible. And I remember his saying to me over and over again when he left, the only good thing about our technological society, John, is that I can be back with you in 24 hours no matter where I am. And you call and I will be there. Then last, a few ideas that I would share. He wrote a book, and the one I worked with him the most on, always at the edge, I felt, is Medical Nemesis. This is an indictment of the institution of medicine. In the book, he talks about iatrogenesis. Iatrogenic is a term out of medicine, a Greek root, means doctor-created disease. All right? Now, since Hippocrates, people in medicine have understood how likely doctor-created disease is, right? Because the Hippocratic oath ends with what words? But this above all, don't treat, don't cure, do no harm, right? So, in the book, he talks about what medicine as an institutionalized form that pervades the culture, that it has not one doctor-created disease, but three. And so he's talked about physical iatrogenesis, social iatrogenesis, and cultural iatrogenesis. That the institution of medicine does three harms. And when I review, I want to say what they are. They aren't related to medicine alone. They apply to any institution. The first is the one we think of, the physical harm that the medical system could do to a person, right? The second is social iatrogenesis. That is the harm that is done when people believe their health is in a doctor and a hospital. so that their community, their associations, their friendships, their history, and their culture have no place in their health. The health is a commodity dispensed by a system, right? And once that happens, then social iatrogenesis is the delegitimization of the community knowing, the cultural knowing of a healthy life. One of his best friends of my best friends was a radical doctor named Robert Mendelsohn, who wrote a book that's still available. I encourage you to read it, called The Confessions of a Medical Heretic. And Mendelsohn, in his latter days, would say to every patient who'd come in to describe the malady, he'd say, "What does your grandmother think it is?" He said, "Because she has the wisdom of ages. I'm just a dink who learned a little bit about technology in a medical school." And then he would say, "What would your grandmother say you should do?" Right? That fact that we all laugh at the question is proof of which side of the line our heads are on, right? We are doctor-created technology believers in health, right? If we don't think our grandmother knows. And the third kind is cultural iatrogenesis, which is the belief in systems as the providers of well-being. Right? That finally our well-being is dependent on what systems can do. Right? And that then creates a culture of institutionalism rather than of community. Schools do this, legal systems do this, doctors do this. He had a library. After he closed CDOC in 1976, he bought a little plot of land in an Indian village near Cuernavaca, a little Indian village called Ocotepeque. I think he was the only non-Indian living in the village, right? And in that little plot of land, he had a building, I don't know, about this big, and it was full of 10,000 books, carefully chosen. He thought there was nothing worth knowing that he could not find out in that library in that Indian village in Ocotepeque, and he tried to sell the Mexican government on buying those 10,000 books for every village in Mexico, so that there's no need to get people to go away and waste their lives in universities and all that kind of rattletrap stuff, right? So he loved when I would come, he'd say, "What would we like to know about?" Right? And we'd think of things we'd like to know about. And then he'd disappear into the library, right? Come back in, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes with an arm full of books. And go through these books. There were bibliographies of bibliographies, and then bibliographies, and then the books they referred to. And this is before the age of computers, right? At any rate, one of the things that came out of one of those inquiries was that I said to him, "Ivan, tell me about the word management. What's the history of management?" So he went back and he came back and shuffled through all these books. And what we learned was, if you went back to even probably 1900 and you said, "Who is a manager?" Anybody know what most people here in the United States would have said in 1900 if you asked, "Who is a manager?" Well, your great-grandparents would have said, "A housewife." A homemaker, we would say. It's a word that applied to a housewife. And it indicated, unlike a shoemaker who could only do one thing, a housewife could do everything. She had so many things to be concerned about. The garden, and she had the chickens, and the sewing, and the children. And so this multiplicity of responsibilities was something that management was associated with. And then we began to develop Henry Ford. And we had such complex institutions that we began to realize what we needed was people who could control lots of stuff, not like the shoemaker. And so we stole the word management from the community and its women and gave it to imperial men at the top of hierarchies. And to him, that was a perfect example of the transition from a culturally communal society to a technological managed society. I brought along a few books I wanted to commend and then tell you one other story. On schools. I have all of his books, but these are the ones, if I were going to commend some to other people, I'd commend the most. This one, Deschooling Society, is still, I think, the most useful critique of institutions that I'm aware of. It's not long, and it helped everyone realize what the real function of school is. And helps you think about what you would do if you wanted to promote learning and wisdom rather than schools. All right? One that probably tells more about his belief system than any other is called Ivan Illich in Conversation. And the editor is David Cayley, a series of tape-recorded discussions with Illich 2 or 3 years before he died. One is a lovely metaphorical piece called H2O and the Waters of Forgetfulness, comparing the difference between the stuff that comes out of your tap when you turn it on, that sort of clear liquid that comes out, with the water of the Ganges. Right? If you bathe in the Ganges, your sins will be washed away and you will be purified. But the water's dirty. But if you turn on the H2O, you will never have the waters of forgetfulness or forgiveness washing over you. You will have sanitized toilet water and call it pure. Right? It's a wonderful revelation. And then the last one is called The Challenges of Ivan Illich, which is a book in which his friends each wrote about 2 or 3 years before he died, a reflection on his thought or on his life. And I was looking it over in the last 2 days, and I find it very, very helpful. Let me tell you one other story here. One time I went to see him in Mexico while I had just been to church, and it was a week or two after Easter. And the text was about Mary Magdalene, I think from the Gospel of Luke, in which Mary is at the tomb, and a man appears beside her, and she thinks he's the gardener and asks him if she can take Jesus' body. And she's looking at the man, and the man is Jesus. And finally, Jesus says, "Mary," and she recognized him. And so I wrote my little question down on my piece of paper to ask Ivan. And I took it down and I said, "Ivan, why is it that when Jesus reappeared, that Mary didn't know who he was, didn't recognize him?" And he said this to me. He said, "John," he says, "in about 1200, there was a man in Italy who figured out a different way of painting on canvas. Said up to that time, all pictures were iconographic, flat. So, but this man figured out that if you put a little point someplace on the canvas and then draw lines into it and do your painting in relationship to those lines and receding, you will make on a flat piece of paper something that looks like what you see, perspective." The man's name is Giotto. So he said, we came then to the threshold of the capacity to know how to put on a piece of paper what we used to just be able to see. And we began to think that people who could put it on paper better than other people were better people. So then a couple centuries later, there was another Italian who was fiddling around with his eyeglasses, and he made a telescope, what we call a telescope. And he looked up in the sky, and all of a sudden he saw mountains on the moon and rings around Saturn. He said, and all of a sudden we had a way of knowing how weak and bad our eyes are. Just as we came to see how we didn't see as well as the painter, the scientists made us understand that our own eyes didn't see what's up there. But with technology, we would know what's really there. And then not long after that, another man was fooling around with lenses, and instead of looking at the sky, he looked through lenses at little tiny things. And he looked in a drop of water, and he saw in that water thousands of little things that you couldn't see. He said, so we developed techniques and technology, right, that steadily led us to understand how limited our eyes are. And we kept developing things like that. That were so much better than our senses, that finally we now have a wonderful glass tube that we can look at all evening, right? We can sit and look at the world out there on a glass tube in our living room, right? All made up. None of it us. We're seeing nothing. But the technology now has made the world we're living in. And he went on to say, we also now have not only lost our sight, but we've lost our touch. We believe we will have relationships by typing on a computer. So we have lost our power of our sight. We have lost the power of our touch. We abhor our natural smell, and so we constantly cover ourselves over with artificial smells and sprays for men now. Right? And we despise hearing the birds, so we plug our ears with little machines that will allow us to walk down the street, listening to somebody else, so we can't even hear our world. And you ask me, John, why Mary didn't recognize Jesus? You live in a senseless world. And Mary had a time when her senses didn't tell her that her friend was here. But he called her name. And she said, "Oh, I know who you are." And in his latter years, Ivan, I think, came to believe that the ultimate crime of institutionalization of our lives is that they erase and replace our senses, so that we do not feel each other, we do not touch, we therefore do not see, hear, we do not know. And that makes us senseless. And we live in a world of nonsense. And it's got 105 categories of nonsense that you can go to every evening. Right? How do you want your nonsense tonight? How do you want to be removed from your relationships with your neighbor? It comes in 105 flavors. Or it comes on a keyboard and a computer. All kinds of nonsense tools. Right?
Are we going to take questions at the end?
Yeah. Just a minute. And then the other thing I think he concluded was, we need our senses to be friends. And that the ultimate possibility of community and culture is the capacity for friendship. And since I'm in a church, let me give you a religious reference. Let's read it. Yes. We're in Holy Week. Friday is Memorial Date of the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, we know what the Gospels say that Jesus said, and I've always thought that must have been the time when he was trying to sum up and make clearest his basic truth. And he says something we all know: "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friend." And this we don't hear very often. "You are my friends if you do what I command you. I do not call you servants any longer, for you know now what the Father knows. So Christian service is something that I don't think Jesus ever called for. And he wanted to make it clear at the end. And he said, I'm not saying be servants. Specific, I'm not. I'm saying the ultimate value isn't service, it is friendship. And that is why when the pastor here might say to people, stop helping everybody. Right? The alternative is friendship. And the name for a circle of friends is community. And their way of being and surviving and knowing is called culture. So those are the things that an old guy's memory can pull forward about years with Illich, and I'd be happy to respond to any thoughts or other questions. Yes, sir.
I have a comment and two questions. My comment is that
He always uses the word beyond a certain intensity. And I always think of the Charlie Chaplin movie where Charlie gets caught in the giant gears of the machine. I mean, the question is, have you not seen in your life that point where you are working for the machine rather than the machine is working for you? And I don't think eyeglasses are at that level.
I have a dear friend who is a research scientist working to cure cancer.
Yes.
Without a microscope, his work would be severely limited.
Yes.
And so I would challenge Ivan's statements that you shared with us in that regard.
Yeah. He would say, isn't it quaint you believe in a cancer-free world? I don't think I could draw myself to say that, but he would say that. It's a quaint idea you have. Not scientific. Your first question about Barack. Actually, I have sat for evenings with Barack talking with him as a young man. You know, he was a community organizer in Chicago. And he was doing that organizing under the training of an organization that I co-founded. So I knew him as a young man. And we've had discussions, actually, about the question of community capacity as against institutional provision. And in a thing he's written, he even cites that discussion. So I think he's aware of the dimensions that we're talking about. Do I think I could dissuade him from national health insurance? Not on your life. Yes, sir.
I was in my study one day, and this guy came in criticizing the organized church, organized religion. Organizations are evil. I said, how did you find me? He used the phone directory.
Yes. Good. You know, one of the questions about a church, which I've had considerable discussion with Ivan about, is I want to make a distinction here between what I would call an association, a flat organization, as against an institution, a hierarchical one. What is a church? In the neighborhood I used to live in, there was a Roman Catholic church called St. Rita's, and it was clearly for the neighborhood, the organizing culture. We wouldn't have been nearly the neighborhood we were without St. Rita's Church, and I think that may be true of this church as well. Right? It was the richest community organization in the area. But there was a guy in Rome who thought it was the bottom tier of a hierarchy. So what is it? And I don't know that I can answer that question. Someone else?
I just want to be mindful of time.
Yeah.
Perhaps, John, invite Mari Evans up
Oh, yes.
one more time to read a powerful piece that she's written. Hi, Mari.
I continue to learn. It's okay? Okay. I continue to learn, no matter what one writes, the reader inevitably brings their experience to the piece. And I have been told, where's Mike? That this piece could reasonably be seen as a metaphor for the effort to create or build a community. It's called Celebration. I will bring you someone whole, and you will bring me someone whole, and we will have us twice as much of love and everything. I be bringing a whole heart, and while I do have nicks and dents and scars, that only make me lay it down more careful-like. And you be bringing a whole heart, a little chipped and rusty, and sometimes skip a beat. But still in all, you bringing polish too, and look like you intend to make it shine. And we be bringing each of us the music of ourselves to wrap the other in. And forgiving clarities, soft as a choir's last lingering note, our personal blend. I will bring you someone whole, and you will bring me someone whole. And we be twice as strong, and we be twice as sure, and we will have us twice as much of love and everything.
Thank you. John, do you have a frame to send folks home with tonight?
A final one?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I don't need this. In this book of sort of a memorial book of essays about Illich, I wrote one, and at the end, I thought I would read you what I said. Any of you know a musician called Paul Winter? He's a rather unusual semi-jazz musician, but he's made a fair number of records that are based on the sounds of animals. He's gone out in the wild and listened to animals and then tried to write pieces that reflect their sounds and their language. And I had a chance to spend an afternoon with him. And so I wrote, Paul Winter is a musician who has attempted to give musical voice to the sounds of animals. He has spent endless hours in the wild watching wolves and birds and whales while listening to their voices. He says the things distinguishing these animals for him, the thing that distinguishes them for him is that one can see in them that every sense is alert, alive, focused, and sensitive. Consider the deer, the hawk, the schools of fish, or a field mouse. Every sense alive and aware. And then, Winter points out, we call these animals wild, which means not civilized, uncivilized. By civilized, we mean a person who will sit quietly in a classroom or a symphony hall and hopefully open at least one ear or one eye. Winter points to the paradox of sensual awareness being called wild and muted, limited sensefulness being called civilized. In Ivan Illich, this is not a paradox. About civilized life, whether vernacular or institutional, there is no one I know who sees it all so clearly. And at the same time, he is the wildest man and the best friend I have ever known.
John, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Like I said, I think that we could probably discuss this until the wee hours, maybe until the wee weeks, in the wee months, in the wee years, and I hope that we continue that conversation in this city and in this world. And I appreciate you, John, for everything that you do and every person who you are.
Yeah, and what a community you have.
Thank you, John. I wanted to, before we leave this evening, I think we're all kind of special guests here. We have some friends from afar with us, and I just wanted to thank them for coming as nearby as Cincinnati.